Thank you. So first, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. And with all due respect, I will give my talk in English. We are going to talk about the Grothendieckien approach that the idea is to give you a sense of the type of work that Grothendieck done. Like in the case of Kafka, the writer, that we have a work, the Kafkaesque. In the case of Grothendieck, it's very interesting because Grothendieck himself told us that his approach was la mer qui monte. And in that case, this quote of Victor Hugo is very, very precise, because not only because the word étaler was used by Grothendieck in one of his mind tools, but because the idea that there is a sea that covers, that is working in silence, that has certain naturality in the work that that does. So first, we are going to have a sense of the idea of form and structure in the case of Grothendieck. Grothendieck's contributions are remarkable not only for its breadth, ranging from the proof of highly non-trivial results, to the invention of novel concepts, to the creation of new theories, but for the coherence of vision that guided all. Underlying these achievements is a distinctive approach centered on a masterful and creative use of language. In fact, we can advance the idea that Grothendieck was himself a writer that did mathematics. He was always searching for more flexible concepts, for subtle points of view that could act as seeds for new unifying principles. He told us, like in the quote, that the idea is to have a language that can cerner the different point of views. So the idea is to, because for Grothendieck, he approached mathematics in a very sensible way. And in the case of this conference, that is Les mathématiques comme expérience artistique, the idea is to try to convey that Grothendieck did mathematics as a human endeavor, that he is very connected to his senses, that he is trying to be a testimony of certain approach, of certain authenticity. So we have here the relation, the very important relation between the language choice and the different point of views. This method is closely linked to the central role of abstraction in the structural thinking. In general, a structure abstracts away the substance of the objects involved and instead emphasizes the form of the relationships. This abstract approach has, from the beginning, been tied to our ability to denote and express things. As Grothendieck says here, penser, c'est exprimer par un langage, et qui dit langage, dit abstraction. So in the case of Grothendieck, when he is trying to create a language in order to have all these points of view together, he is trying to do it in an abstract way. And this abstraction is very important in his case because he is trying to develop a language that is an structural language. Grothendieck says that of all the things that he cares most in the way that he can access to the objects of mathematics, it is the form that interests him most. And in all the forms that they can present is the structure, clearly linked to his abstract point of view, to his way of developing languages in order to have all these points of view together. But there is a very important point here, and is that in the question of whether or not mathematical objects exist and in which way, Grothendieck say that the object that he is seeking, the structures, he cannot invent them. He can only discover them. What he can invent is the language. As he say, nous pouvons seulement la mettre à jour pratiquement, humblement, en faire connaissance, la découvrir. So in this sense in which he is trying to discover the language, to have all these points of view, to find the structure behind the objects of his interest. So he is trying to relate the fact that he is inventing the language with the power of his expression and the way he apprehends the things. This is very important in his case. So we are going to try to, with all these ideas in mind, the idea of point of view, the idea of language, the structural thinking, the idea of abstraction, we are now trying to cover the life of Grothendieck from a global point of view. So I'm going to suppose you have certain elements of his biography already. So in the case of the beginning of his career that started at the beginning of the 50s, until the end of the 60s, Grothendieck was mostly interested in the general, in applying the discovery of this language, the idea of those different points of views, to look for the general. From the very beginning, Grothendieck placed a strong emphasis on generality, an integral part of certain attitudes. In fact, one feature common to nearly all of his contributions, namely schemes, were already in the air at the time. His decisive contribution was to overcome a psychological barrier through a simplification by generalizing existing approach. His appropriation of the language of the time, as well as his interest in certain problems, led him to formulate ideas in relation to a principle of relative variation. The idea of relative variation is very important because he is trying to use different languages to cover all these points of view at the same time. So in the relative case, he started using a form of structural thinking that is more diagrammatic, as we will see in the presentation. As was often the case with Grothendieck, this structural thinking also means an aesthetical standpoint, as he will omnipresently use the notation in his lectures. He will always start with this arrow in his lectures. And from this arrow, he will move to the diagram and study the following type of questions. Knowing the properties of x, what can be deduced from x prime? This is the theory of Monte. And conversely, knowing the properties of x prime, what can be deduced from x? And here we are going to try to give you a sense of the level of generality in which Grothendieck is moving, because the nature of these elements, of these objects, is complete abstract. Later, the notion of Grothendieck topology will allow the transposition of the topological intuition into the Zen theory. Another example of this time was his renewed study of points, as was saying Professor Lafort. The rich and complex tradition of geometry has debated its definition for centuries. One common ancient view is that a point is a monad with position, a monad that has no internal structure, nor does a point. With the introduction of topological spaces, points are entirely absent from the topological theorization of space. It is the structure generated by the open sets that generates the space. A topological space is a set of points provided with a topological structure. But with the notion of topos, Grothendieck reintroduced points in the topological discourse, granting them not only renewed relational presence, but also a rich internal structure and context dependency. A punctual topos is the category of sets that we denote as a P, and let E be a topos. A point in a topos is defined as a type of a row. And this is very interesting because Grothendieck is using here his relative point of view. In this sense, points can be said that are now outside the space, rather than contained within it. In classical theory, points are intrinsically indistinguishable from one another. They differ only in position. In other words, there exists an archetypal point of which all others are mere instances or representations. With Grothendieck, however, the nature of a point depends on the chosen topos. Interestingly enough, in this framework, it is possible to construct non-trivial spaces that has no points. Now that we have covered very lightly the topic of which Grothendieck was most known for, we are going to treat other parts of his lives for decades and also for the topics covered. In the case of the 70s, Grothendieck has a very important shift because he now has a pedagogical turn, because he is now teaching students, and now these shifts led him to broaden his interest toward mathematical objects that were more accessible to students with moderate backgrounds. Two-dimensional shapes turned out to offer such a common ground. It was the study of combinatorial aspects of this surface that increasingly captured Grothendieck's attention. The realization that these seemingly simple objects were deeply connected to algebraic geometry come as something of a revelation to him, sparking new direction in his research, this time with an accent on the particular. One of the striking examples of this epoch are the dessin d'enfant, which are certain graphs that you can draw in spheres. But the interesting thing is they are extremely deep, that they have a certain conjectural description of the absolute Galois group that is an object of high interest for mathematicians of several fields. We have some examples here from the scenes. And we have one very interesting here because it really looks like a child drawing. And this is very interesting because we often think Grothendieck as the maximal generalities. But here we are with a very particular case of a very particular diagram. In the 70s, Grothendieck has another turn, one that is very, very interesting. He is now trying to pay more attention to what he says is an spiritual stagnation. He has dedicated so much time to mathematics that he is now lost as a person. And he takes the time and starts working on himself. It was around this time that a Japanese monk from a Buddhist community arrived unannounced at his home in Villacombe. This encounter marked the beginning of a new spiritual quest, though they were not immediately recognized as such. In 1976, Grothendieck discovered a new passion, and is the passion of meditation. In his case, this means a new form of writing. Because, as I told you, he discovers himself, he discovers mathematics, always through writing. In the case of this discovery, he learned the fact that he has peur d'apprendre. And that is very interesting because he's trying now to face his problems. He's trying now to affront his limitations. And he starts working in his very person. First, through the study of the correspondence between his parents. In the 80s, Grothendieck is now part a mathematician, part a writer, and he takes very seriously the meditation, and he starts to shifting between mathematics and meditation, and written meditation. And when he wrote a text, a mathematical text, pursuing stacks à la poursuite du champ, he invents a new way of doing mathematics, of right mathematics, better. He is now trying to convey an idea that when he is trying to find new mathematics, he does it like a human being, with sensations, with problems, with a history behind. So he started writing mathematics as a diary. And he wrote a mathematical text that is called Pursuing Stacks. When he was trying to write an introduction to this new style, he started working in Récolté des Semailles. While he never left mathematics, Grothendieck went also on to combine them, particularly his use of diagrams and the ordering structures of polyhedra with his meditations of the creative process and methods of learning. He, in fact, says that in that process, he discovered a new form of poetry, the nonlinear poetry of diagrammatic poetry, and he starts to study with this new form of writing. But now he is interested in the creative process, in the learning process. How is the process, and in his particular case, of developing mathematics or discovering in general. So he starts to draw some diagrams, but now with another topic. He is still using the diagrammatic approach. The vertices of the diagram are the objects of interest, and the arrows form the drawing. He says that the work that he is doing is very close to his mathematical work. Even he is interested in other things, like the creative process or the learning process. But he is the same. And this is one of the important things I want to convey you, that he is trying to learn the world around him. In this time, he also started working in a new theory, that the idea is to have a new topology without points and concentrate in a direct approach to shape. From the 70s, almost all of Grothendieck's works are unpublished. So these are all works that are still to be worked out, reviewed, and are extremely interesting. For instance, in this case, he is interested in the fact that the universe, in some sense, must be discrete, because we can only have a discrete experience of it. But the mathematics that has been used to describe are continuous. So the idea of having a new kind of topology that doesn't refer directly to the continuity, but to certain regions, like in the experience of physics, is leading Grothendieck to a new kind of geometry that he develops in the 80s. Here we have some structures of the original. He is still using his diagrammatic thinking. That in the case of the 80s, he is interested mainly in the learning process, in the creative process, but now, at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, he has become more and more interested in spiritual things. A new epoch in Grothendieck's life began with a meditation of his own spiritual path, as documented in La Clef des Songes. A decisive step came through his parallel investigation, on the one hand, of spiritual communities, and on the other, of spiritual figures, culminating in the concluding notes titled The Mutants. That is the last part of La Clef. While Marcel Legault, that is one of the mutants, played an influential role, it was above all Chardin and Steiner, through their vision of a new kind of science that mostly shaped Grothendieck orientation in the years that followed. Grothendieck was now interested in a new form of science that has a principle of a spiritual nature. He becomes interested in a science that has a spiritual guide that sheds some light on his orientation, of his ends. At that time was equally significant the idea of a direct communication with God, as well as a growing sense of urgency about the coming of a new age, both of which were influenced in part by his encounter with the writer Hélène Cady, who left a lasting mark on him. Around this time, Grothendieck embarked on a vast exploration around this new science, entitled Réflexions sur la vie et le cosmos, encompassing comparative religion, the nature of the psyche, esotericism, physical phenomena, and much more. So he largely departed from tradition. He made extensive use of his own methods and languages. Like an ancient scientist, or one of a very new kind, he was not merely trying to describe the world, but finding its inner harmony. But before we move into that, in the 90s, Grothendieck got a renewed interest in the publication of Pursuing Stacks, the book that I told you before, and he once again turned into homotopy theory. This time, he embarked on an ambitious project to lay proper foundation for the theory of derivators. The idea was to have a formal list of variants of coefficients, like he has done before in the case of cohomology theory, with continuous and discrete coefficients, but now in this case, he's trying to do the same, but for general arrows of the category of categories. We have here some examples of the diagrams used. These diagrams are shown because in his new interest, there is something like a resemblance we are going to see. In his new studies, and as part of Réflexions sur la vie et le cosmos, Grothendieck wrote a text entitled Institut de la Psyché, in which he undertook a systematic study of psychic energy, its exchange, and the various actors involved, both those limited in time and energy and those considered infinite. The entire theory is grounded in the notion of fluence, a type of direct graph through which one can develop a structural theory of trees, forests, in the mathematical sense, functors, and diagrams, all of which represent manifold interaction between actors operating on various levels of energy. As I told you before, he is now trying to study a new kind of science in which there is something like a spiritual motif. And he is trying to find the type of actors in that motif. He still makes use of his diagrammatic thinking. Here we have a diagram, and it's very interesting because in this book he is trying to have a combinatorial theory of personality, of different levels of psychic energy, the very first actions that gave birth to this type of energies. So he started studying all these things in a diagrammatic way. And he develops very incredible, also in the artistic sense, diagrams that study this type of thing. He is now using his mathematics, his languages, to try to convey a point of view in this psychic energy. And in this point, as I told you, he also takes into account the infinite energy. That is the energy of God. He also makes a study of different time frames in which different beings are located, and he studies this all in a categorical way. And then, as part of that immense effort, we have here some gribouillis cosmique, because at some point in that study, he becomes more and more interested in certain esoteric aspects. And he never left the use of the diagrammatic thinking. Even when he is trying to study this type of things. We have here several diagrams in which he is somehow making a cartography of the heavens. Here he studies the different ways in which one can enter these different levels of energy, of psychic energy, the different actors, the songs. And as a conclusion, I would like to say that in the case of Grothendieck is always generalizing, but not only as a way to cover more, but because he is interested in unity. He is trying to, even with a relative approach, he is seeking the absolute. And in this sense, is very interesting because, like the sea at the beginning, we are in front of something that seems infinite. And this gave us a sense of the fact that Grothendieck is always trying to unify. Grothendieck stands as a powerful heir to a long tradition of structural thinking, which he only not inherited but profoundly enriched. At the heart of this enrichment lies a vision in which thinking, abstraction, and language form a single unified movement toward understanding. His life and work are not only inseparable, but are also his ideas, subjects, and methods themselves from one another, as well as the breath that animates them. In this way, through its own perfections and limitations, each part carries within itself the revelation of the whole, not in the details, but in its unity and spirit, is the Grothendieckien approach. Thank you.